Hey everyone, I'm Amanda Thomas, and this is A Scientist Walks Into a Bar, where you can hear recordings of talks given at Science on Tap, a series of events held in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. In this episode, we'll hear from Dr. Barbara Sorg on the topic Memory and the Neuroscience of Addiction. Barb is a professor of neuroscience at Washington State University, Vancouver, and while we recorded this a little while ago in December 2016, it's still relevant and fascinating information about how our brains work. She talks about how humans are wired to seek new experiences and how that can sometimes lead to addiction. She also talked about how addiction is a chronic disease that needs long-term treatment. She finished by describing some of the work her lab was doing using rats to model cocaine addiction. Barb's presentation was very visual, with lots of pictures and several videos, and all of that was great for people in the theater, but the audio is a bit tough to capture for a podcast. We've edited some of the videos out, though we did leave one short video in near the beginning that shows a small boy spinning around to make himself dizzy and falling down while giggling the whole time. I've posted some of the images from her slides on our website, and I'll put the link in the episode description. Near the end, she brought up some people on stage to help with a demonstration. You'll hear a few short voiceovers from me explaining what's going on. Finally, in one of the coolest things we've done on stage, Barb brought an actual human brain with her. I mean, it was in a bucket of formaldehyde, not just the one in her head. Anyway, she invited people to come up afterward and hold the brain. Super cool. With all that, here we go.
Thank you, Amanda, for the invitation. And I also thank my fellow neuroscientists at WSU Vancouver who strongly encouraged me to come and give a talk about drug addiction. And I wanted to start with those films. I'm a scientist, so I guess that means I'm kind of binary, as my friend says here. I won't be talking a lot about the emotions, the emotional aspects, but what I do want to talk about today, or this evening, is what's so compelling about taking these drugs. And so, as you heard on the video, these young women are taking those drugs. They know they're potentially losing their lives, losing their friends and school and so forth. And so what compels people to continue to take these drugs? This evening, I'm going to talk about the idea that we seek novelty and new sensations. So I think this might be at the root of why people end up becoming addicted. And I'll just talk about that at the beginning, and then I want to go on and talk about addiction as a chronic brain disease. And then finally, I'm going to end with some of the work that I've been doing in my lab, the research that we've been working on the last several years on memories of addiction and how memories can trigger addiction and memories can trigger relapse. So we seek novelty and new sensations, and we do this from a very early age. I think everybody's familiar with this little babies exploring their hands and their feet, and they put their hands in front of them. And so how many of you have children? Okay, so quite a few. So what happens when the little baby cries and keeps on crying? What do you do? What are some of the things you do? Give it a binky, okay. That's something new sensation, right? And what if it gets bored? What do you pick them up? Give them something new, right? New sensory input. Okay, so we do this all the time. The baby gets bored, give them something new to do. So this little guy here, they've given this baby a plastic bag, which is not a good thing. We've also given this baby a paper bag, and you can see he's probably exploring the colors on here and the feel of this, some new sensory sensations, maybe the crinkle of the plastic bag. Okay. Here's another experience I think everybody's familiar with. This was just an especially cute version of this. So you can see he's spinning and spinning. He's getting this new sensory input, and he's laughing, right? He's smiling. He's not having a hard time with this at all. He's seeking this on purpose, and he's really enjoying this. And I think probably all of us have gone through that. And then we get to a period, we get a little bit older, and we have to up the ante a little bit more. So you can see these are younger children on this really relatively tame roller coaster ride. But you can see that the high-risk behavior is already starting. Probably started way before this, but they're trying not to hang on because there's some new sensation when you don't hang on, and also it's kind of a risk, and it's seen as a rewarding kind of experience. And then we up the ante a little bit more and get on these kinds of rides. And this, I want to point out a couple things about this slide. You can see this guy in the middle. He's probably in his young 20s, right? He has the wherewithal to take his hand out and take a selfie of himself. And I think those are probably his parents. They kind of look like him. And you can see his face versus their faces. You're not quite sure. And I think you can probably attribute part of this to something that I think many of you are familiar with, and that's the prefrontal cortex. So one of the things about the prefrontal cortex is it does not develop until your 20s. It's not fully developed. So when you think about teenage kids, if you have teenage kids, they do a lot of things without really thinking about it. They're not really seemingly paying attention to the consequences of their actions. And in a lot of ways, I have to say, this is like some addicts. Okay, and people who are addicted to different drugs or alcohol behave the same way. They're not paying attention to the consequences. And this is because, just a heads up, they don't have a very functional prefrontal cortex. So one of the things is that these guys, they've got a fully developed prefrontal cortex. And I do the red lines because one of the things about the prefrontal cortex that Amanda mentions is that it's involved in decision making, and I know a lot of you know that because it seems like a lot of you got that correct, so I'm happy to hear that. This guy, he's got the green prefrontal cortex. That means go. Despite anything else that's happening, just go. Okay, so there's one of the other things related to decision making is that it inhibits a lot of our decision, or it inhibits a lot of our sort of basic urges. And when that prefrontal cortex goes offline, that's a problem. And that seems to happen after drugs of abuse. So I found this quote, just to let you take a look at that. This presidential campaign is about switching off the prefrontal cortex and going with the old gut. And so people know about the prefrontal cortex and decision making, and this would probably be true no matter what side of the campaign, of the equation you're on, I guess. So why do we seek novel sensations? This seems to be hardwired into our brain in some way, but why is that hardwired into our brain? What's the possible advantage of this? Well, we think that it's probably important to have a brain that finds new experiences rewarding, and then also, importantly, memorable. Okay, so we want to form memories for what those experiences were that were rewarding, otherwise you can't seek them out again. And put simply, evolution has favored a brain that finds these things rewarding. So these are cavemen going out and seeking food, and you want them to remember where they got the food, but you also want them to be able to seek out new places. And again, so evolution favors individuals who would seek that novelty. Unfortunately, drugs of abuse hijack that very reward system, and I'll be talking about that in a little bit. So where's the tipping point with this? The tipping point of how much is too much novelty? How much is too much sensation seeking? At some point you would think that that doesn't serve us very well at all. And this might be the point. Sorry. This is let me go backwards. Oh, it does work. Base jumping, okay? So probably everybody's heard of base jumping. It turns out it's more dangerous than just mere skydiving. But at some point, teenagers especially, young kids will start experimenting with cigarettes and alcohol and marijuana. They'll often start with those drugs and then go to these other drugs that aren't necessarily less or more harmful, but what we consider hard drugs, of cocaine shown here. And so that brings me to drug addiction, talking about drug addiction itself. And just to mention, drug addiction is not really used by psychiatrists and psychologists. They call it substance use disorder, and there are all kinds of kind of gradations of substance use disorder. So it's not like you're not addicted, and suddenly you're addicted, but there are all kinds of scales of addiction, or what we call addiction. So the cost of addiction just in Washington State alone is $8 billion a year. This is about, in the nation is about $700 billion a year. And this is in lost productivity and healthcare costs, and of course the costs of crime and fighting crime. And just to put this in perspective, this $8 billion a year, I'm with the higher education system. It turns out that Washington State, this is the total cost that Washington state spends on higher education in the entire state. It's a huge, huge cost. So it affects all of us. The other thing that I thought I would put up here is the annual cost for a K through 12 student. This is in the state of Washington. It's about $10,000 a year, roughly, K through 12 student. And I put up here to juxtapose this with an inmate in Washington state is about $47,000 a year. Now, I know, granted, you can't compare these costs exactly because they're not exactly the same costs in terms of care and so forth, but this is the state is paying that much for an inmate. And it turns out that roughly 60 to up to 85% of inmates have a drug addiction problem. And they're not always getting the proper treatment, and in fact, hardly ever getting the proper treatment while they're incarcerated. So what is addiction? I'll just kind of touch on 3 aspects of it. These are sort of the core features of addiction. It's a brain disease, and it's expressed as a compulsive behavior. It's the continued abuse of drugs despite negative consequences, and I'll talk about, just show you one example of this, that there's a shift in the rewards that happens. And then it's a chronic relapsing disorder. So at this point, I want to talk about the brain, but before I do that, I have a little demonstration. It's not really a demonstration, but it's something I thought you might all like to see. So I'll just put this down for a minute. All right, so I have here a human brain that I'd like to hold up so that you can see it. And you can't tell if this brain is the brain of, say, Albert Einstein. I can tell you it's not. But it could be the brain of a mathematician, could be the brain of a magician, could be the brain of a meth addict, and we don't know that. And the reason we don't know is we have to look inside the brains. And so what I want to talk about next is kind of diving inside the brain and looking at what happens to the brains. So I talked about this addiction as a brain disease. And why do we think it's a brain disease? So I want to show you some evidence that indicates that this is very likely a brain disease. This is the brain of a normal 43-year-old. And so what you're looking at is this, so these would be the ears over here. So this is a live person, right? So you're just looking at the brain. So this is imaging in live humans. And you can tell the alcoholic brain is very different. And in particular, if you look at the dark areas surrounding the brain and right in here and here, those are all fluid-filled spaces that the brain is floating in for protection. You can see really readily the bigger spaces here, that's the fluid areas, and the space around the edge is much larger. And what that means is that the tissue in the brain has effectively shrunk. Okay, so it's smaller, and that means there's less tissue there, and surely that means that the brain has changed its function. An example of these brains, so these are postmortem brains, so obviously not in the human anymore. But this is just as a comparison to show you the brain of a normal elderly person, the brain of a person with Alzheimer's disease, and you can see there's not as much tissue here compared to the normal person, and you can see what happens under alcoholism. So again, really severe decrease in the brain structure, and we know in the brain function. So I have another example of that shown, and this is in monkeys. They don't do so much monkey research anymore, but this was done quite a while ago. And this is looking at serotonin. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter, and it's one of the important neurotransmitters that communicates between brain cells, so it allows that communication to occur. So what you're looking at here is this is part of the outer cortex of the brain in the monkey, and we're looking at fibers that have serotonin in them. What happens, 2 weeks after ecstasy, this monkey had 8 doses of ecstasy. Okay, so not a lot, but a reasonable amount of ecstasy. And you can see those serotonin fibers are diminished dramatically. And even after 7 years, they kept some of these monkeys, one monkey, for 7 years, and they looked to see what would happen. And you can see it's recovered some, but it's still not back to normal. So there's some brain damage here, and we don't know if this some of these will recover their cognitive functions after that much time, but we think that because this structure of the brain is different, that the function must be different. And you can dive down into the very brain cells and look at changes in the structure of the brain cells. You can even see lots and lots of changes in hundreds of genes that are changed. Either some genes get expressed more, some genes get expressed less with repeated treatment with these drugs of abuse. So I want to talk about this as a brain disease and thinking about how you would measure the outcome of brain disease. And by comparison, I want to look at another type of disease, a very common disease that we think of, hypertension, and how we treat hypertension. So on here is showing hypertension symptoms. So you think about worst symptoms up here, and it says pre, and that means before anybody would take an antihypertensive drug. So when they take the antihypertensive drug, the symptoms go down, no surprise, right? That's how we manage hypertension. And then if you were to say, take them off of it, so post-treatment, so just say you take them off the drug, they stop taking the antihypertensive, you would expect some kind of relapse to happen. These symptoms come back, okay? Maybe some or all come back. And that's no surprise. So do we have an effective antihypertensive treatment? We would say yes. Okay, we've got something. The heart might not be normal, the vessels might not be normal, and they may never go back to normal, but we have a pretty effective treatment that can manage that disease state. So if we think now about addiction treatment, we have pretty much the same picture. Here's a number of symptoms, and someone goes into treatment, whatever that treatment is. It could be behavioral, it could be kind of a pharmaceutical treatment that they're taking, and then they don't have the symptoms. And if they stop undergoing treatment, say they get out of a treatment program, they go back home, and often what you see is a relapse. Okay? Basically, they're not in treatment anymore. Do we think this is do we have an effective treatment for addiction? Well, generally speaking, people think no. But in fact, what you need is to treat this disease as a chronic disease. And so one of the problems is they might go through a 12-week program or a 6-week program, go back into their normal environment, and they will often relapse. And so that's kind of the same thing as expecting these people to not relapse when they stop taking antihypertensive drugs. So do we think this is a moral failure? No, this would be ridiculous to think this is a moral failure. So I think we should think about the same thing when we talk about addiction treatment. It requires a chronic treatment regime for many people, not for all. So what do drugs do to the brain to make this a disease? A big player in this is dopamine. Probably a lot of you have heard of dopamine as this kind of pleasure, involved in the pleasure circuit. When you take dopamine, or when you eat chocolate, you have a surge of dopamine in your brain. So here's the part of the brain that this acts on. We have the frontal cortex, and this includes that prefrontal cortex that we talked about earlier. We have the nucleus accumbens, a very critical area, and then this VTA, another area. So these three areas are all kind of forming that circuit, and drugs of abuse all increase dopamine, and that seems to increase, that mediates that reward effect that we all have. So if you think about this, it's kind of strange, but there are hundreds of drugs that are on the market, right? All kinds of drugs, antihypertensive drugs, lots and lots of drugs. It's really only a handful that people become addicted to. Of course, we hear about these because they cause so many problems, but it's really only a handful, and it's those drugs that increase dopamine about 5 to 10 times higher than what, say, a piece of chocolate, or sex, or nurturing the young, all these things that are pleasurable that increase dopamine, it just gets ramped up. So if any of you have seen the movie Spinal Tap, I say that it's kind of like dopamine turned up to 11. And the other thing that doesn't get talked about a lot, but that when dopamine is increased, you increase the memory strength. So whatever you're doing when that dopamine goes up, that memory is a little bit stronger. If the dopamine is elevated, really amped up, say 10 times, that memory becomes that much stronger. And that's why we think these addiction memories are very difficult to shake. So I want to look down into the neurons now and look at the brain cells of these neurons, this kind of tangled mess of neurons here. What do these look like? Well, they look something like this. Here's the brain cell here, the neuron. And then they have these axon terminals. This is where the signals travel from one neuron to the next neuron. And then at the end of these, you have these axon terminals. So these are coming from other neurons into this neuron here. And they're coming in right here, and they'll release a neurotransmitter like dopamine or serotonin or one of hundreds of other transmitters. And so I just want to show you a picture. So here's the signals going down the axon from one cell to the next cell to the next, and now it's going to terminate here in that axon terminal. The signal's going to come down here in a minute, and then you're going to release the neurotransmitter, and you can imagine this as dopamine, a bunch of little molecules of dopamine coming out. And so we're going to look at a close-up picture of this, looking at dopamine here. So these are in these little balls here, these little vesicles, and it's going to dump out here in this little space, like this. So the dopamine molecules come out, they get released, and then there are all these receivers, these blue things, they're little receivers of dopamine called receptors. They'll bind to the dopamine, and when they bind to the dopamine, the signal travels on that next cell, and it goes on down the line, and that next cell is really important in, say, the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens, the areas I talked about, and that mediates this reward and helps trigger the memory. So I want to show you a picture of a brain, and this would be in a person who's taking cocaine, because that's what I study in my lab, so I thought I would show you this. I think it's really interesting. So here's an image, PET image of someone. This is the front of the brain, and you can see that when they take dopamine, these yellow little spots are moving into an area, the nucleus accumbens that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so you can see that happens very quickly, and then by about 10 minutes, it's pretty much gone. And that's why cocaine is a really short-acting drug. And people will binge on that over and over because it gets in their brain very, very quickly within a couple minutes, and then it gets out of their brain quickly. So in thinking about this, where this dopamine comes out, and it's binding to these receptors. So what happens is, I just told you earlier, I said, when you take some drugs of abuse, it just really revs up the dopamine. So you get just a ton of dopamine coming out into that little space there, this synaptic space, binding to these receptors. It turns out your body's pretty good at compensating for that. So what happens is your body starts decreasing those receptors. It's too much dopamine, and it's saying, stop sending me this signal. I want to reduce that stimulation I'm getting. And so this is what happens in people who are addicted to cocaine, meth, alcohol, and heroin. So here's a control brain. Okay, so again, we're looking at the top of the brain, and this is the nucleus accumbens here. And you can see that the brighter the color is, that's just darker, it's just more binding, essentially more binding of that dopamine to its receptor. So we're now looking at the receivers, the receptors. And you can see every case, in the addicted individuals, there's less dopamine receptor. Okay? So the thought is if there's less dopamine receptor, it means you're not really feeling the reward as much. And the idea is that you may have less reward from natural reinforcers, like a job or doing well on an exam or a relationship. So you just don't have the same level of reward because you can't feel it because you don't have enough dopamine receptors. So this was a really interesting study, but it brought up this idea of, well, wait a minute, we don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg. What if people already have low receptors and they can never feel that reward, and so they're always seeking something that will boost that rewarding feeling from whatever it is that they're doing. And so that question came up, and the way they did this was kind of a clever way. In humans, they've done these studies in animals, of course, but in humans, they had to make sure it's safer. And so what they did was they said, we have people, we just scanned enough brains. Again, same thing, this is the nucleus accumbens area. There's a natural variation in the dopamine receptors, the number of dopamine receptors. So all of us in the room, we have different numbers of dopamine receptors in our nucleus accumbens. So we have, this person has high receptors and this person has low. And they said, well, let's just give them kind of a safe drug, Ritalin. Kids take Ritalin for ADHD. And that's an amphetamine-like drug that will bind here, and we can see and measure how amphetamine feels. So they said, well, let's see. So somebody with high receptors, it turns out they don't feel very good when they have it. They get kind of agitated, the heart rate, and they just don't feel very good when they take Ritalin. But the person with low dopamine receptors feels very good on this. So they said, oh, okay, it might be that it's kind of a double whammy. You start with low receptors, you might be more liable to become addicted. And then you take these drugs and it makes the receptors even lower. So now it's even more difficult for you to feel normal pleasure from normal everyday events. And so this seems like this is what probably is happening. At least this is one big piece of the story. It's certainly not the whole story. So one of the other criteria that I talked about was there's continued abuse of drugs despite negative consequences. And I think everybody's familiar with this. But one of the things that's interesting is to look at this study where they looked at an actual shift in the rewards and how your brain just automatically processes rewards. To do this study, they said, well, we're going to take normal subjects and give them a cocaine film to look at or an erotic film. And then we're going to look at, there were a couple different areas in the frontal cortex that would light up differently, okay, between watching this film and this film. And they said, okay, this part of the brain lights up when you see an erotic film. This part of the brain doesn't seem to care when it sees, a person doing cocaine, have the cocaine, the paraphernalia associated with taking cocaine. The opposite happens in cocaine users. So they care a lot more about this cocaine film and lights up that same brain area much more than does the erotic film. So I mentioned it's a chronic relapsing disorder, and why do we think that's the case? Nobody would really care if you were, say that you drank a lot and you went back to the bar and you had one drink. That's not really considered a relapse. That wouldn't really be a problem. It's because people will, relapse and take a lot, and they'll have a really tough time staying off that drug again. So why do we think it's a relapsing disorder, and why do people go back to these drugs maybe after years of being abstinent from the drug? Well, these drug memories are strong, and so I want to talk about this from the perspective of forming drug memories, because that's the area of our research that we try to target those memories to decrease them. So that brings me to the research that I do, and all the studies that I do are with cocaine. I haven't studied other drugs of abuse at this point. And also, as you can guess, I study rats. Okay, so everything that I'll be talking about is in rats. So I have to show you first a comparison, the human brain, which you just saw, a real one, and then this little rat brain. And I have, for comparison, I'll just hold it up, but you can come afterwards and see this. This is the rat brain in this little jar. Okay? So it looks a lot different, right? It's very smooth, it doesn't have all these convolutions in it, and it's very tiny. But it turns out that it's remarkably similar. All those neurotransmitters that I talked about, there are over 100 neurotransmitters in the brain, they're all the same, because this is still a mammalian brain. And the connections, even though it's a lot smaller, a lot of the connections are the same. So if we can figure out what happens in the rat, we can translate a lot of that to the human condition. So how do we form these memories? Just thinking about, how would you form a drug memory? Okay, so you have memories for how the drugs make you feel. Here we have, this is supposed to be, I stole this from Megan Slaker, who just finished her PhD in my lab, by the way, a couple of weeks ago. So this is a euphoric, I guess, euphoria that you might feel from drugs. And then just as importantly, this is showing the withdrawal effects. Okay, so how many coffee drinkers do we have out there? Like regular coffee drinkers, okay. So how many of you get headaches if you don't drink coffee? So a number of you, okay. So you know the effects, you're familiar with the effects of withdrawal. I call it caffeine deprivation headache, CDH. Because that can drive you to continue to take it, right? And you can imagine if you could amplify that by 10 times or potentially 50 times, we don't really know, but that would drive you to continue to take the drug, and that alone might do it. And then we have the memory for the drug environment. So who are the people that you take the drugs with? Where are the places that you go? Or maybe you go purchase your drug. We create kind of separate memories for that. And then we also create memories for the drug cues. I mentioned earlier that video that people were watching, the cocaine video, that was of somebody taking cocaine. So all they're doing is seeing these cocaine cues that become very associated or very strong memories in the brains of people who do this repeatedly. And so all of these things kind of link up to form what I just call drug memories, probably all over the brain. And then these drug memories seem to drive, at least in a very strong way, the motivation to take drugs and then to continue to take drugs or to relapse. To talk about memories, we have to think about how they're formed in the first place. And I'll just be the first one to say that nobody really knows what a memory is. No neuroscientist does, and if they say they do, they're lying. Because we really don't know, they're still elusive. But here's some things that we do know about memory. If you have an experience, and let's just say this is a drug experience that they have, and they will consolidate or stabilize that memory into some stored memory. Okay, and that could be, again, all over the brain, different places we store memories. And then it turns out we now know that that is not forever. We can recall or retrieve that memory, and it's susceptible to either strengthening or weakening. So if you think about something simple like studying for an exam over and over and over, and let's say you do it over several weeks, you're strengthening that memory probably by this process. But that memory for a while becomes unstable. Okay, this is probably for 5-6 hours. That memory is unstable, and then it goes back and restabilizes, reconsolidates into the stored memory. So if you, like I said, if you're studying for an exam, this process is probably happening over and over and over. And I think all of us are familiar with the idea that you might be able to modify memories in some way. Okay, so thinking of court, what am I thinking of? Like court in the courtroom, right? Eyewitness accounts. So yeah, so you can have very unreliable accounts of the events that happened. And so one of the problems with that is this reconsolidation process, because it does become unstable. And that reconsolidation process requires a whole series of molecular events, just a bunch of stuff that goes on in the brain. We're still trying to figure all that out. But it turns out that you could take those events, and we know some of them that happen, and you can block them. And if you block them, you can block this reconsolidation process and somehow, we think, reduce that stored memory in some way, or maybe just the ability to retrieve it. Maybe it's still there, nobody really knows. But we can diminish specific memories that get recalled, okay? So only the memories that get recalled get diminished by this process. And so we were looking at this ourselves and looking at this blockade of reconsolidation. And here I just wanted to show you, I kind of think of reconsolidation as rewriting memories because they're kind of always morphing. Every time you retrieve it, it might change just a little bit. It might become stronger, might become weaker, and it might also just change a little bit. Okay, so we're interested in this prefrontal cortex, since we've been talking about that. The prefrontal cortex sends connections to these other two important areas. So basically, you got this entire circuit that's talking to each other, and it's really important. In particular, we were interested in, about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, became really interested in these things called Peri neuronal nets. And these are just beautiful, fragile little structures. We're going to dive down deep into the brain now, and we're going to look at those Peri neuronal nets, and they're shown here in the green. So all these little green things here, they wrap around nets. So you can imagine just a net that basically just wraps around certain brain cells. Not all brain cells, certainly, but just some brain cells, and very important ones, that we think help hold the memory for cocaine and other drugs. So here's a picture. This is from Dr. John Harkness in my lab. So this is a brain slice that he took from a rat, and you can see the kind of 3D structure. You can see they're just sort of hollow because the cells, right, there's some little neurons inside of each one of these. And because they're neurons, they're all connected to each other. So we have these are supposed to be the axons coming from other neurons, as I showed you earlier. And then the terminals come in here, right? And so I just drew a bunch of these coming in. And here are the cells that are inside each one of these. And when you look at this thing, it kind of looks a little bit like this table right here, okay? So that brings me to another demonstration. And I have 3 volunteers, but I need 1 more volunteer to come up here and sit in one of these chairs. This looks a lot like the table and the chairs, and in fact, I like the analogy because these people sitting in the chairs would come together to communicate with that cell. So, oh great, thank you.
There was a small round table on stage, and 3 or 4 volunteers came up and sat in chairs around the table. One of the people, Megan, will stand up shortly and leave her chair empty.
Okay, so what I would like to do is think about these cells and what would happen if you didn't have a perineuronal net around the cell, and then what would happen if you do have a net around the cell. So one thing that I'm going to ask Megan to do, and this is Dr. Megan Slaker. She just finished her PhD in my lab a couple of weeks ago, and Megan gets to be the lucky one because she's the one who did the majority of the work on these perineuronal nets that I'm presenting to you. So, Megan, if you can just stand up for a moment and just stand over there for a second. Okay, so I want you to see, this is the cell, the table is the cell. You guys are the terminals, the axon terminals, sitting around the table and communicating. And she's gonna be a new axon terminal coming in, and I want you to see how easy it is for her to come and sit down. Okay, easy, right? Okay, so now if you get up again, and I'm gonna have you hold this in.
All right.
All right, so we're gonna say this thing here, this piece of tape that I have, is a perineuronal net. A perineuronal net. All right.
Barb wrapped a piece of tape around the seated people and the empty chair.
Okay, so let's say we have a little bit of a net here around this cell. Megan, how about if you try to sit down? Oh, that made it too easy. Okay, we gotta put the chair. All right. Okay, now you have to get up again. We're gonna have to do something different. All right, finally, one more thing is we're gonna wrap this. So now we say, we've got a nice, thick net, a very intense green net, even though I couldn't find any green tape because it blends in with the scenery, I guess. That's why they don't make it green. Okay. All right, Megan, help yourself.
Barb had wrapped the tape around all the people and the empty chair several times to make it harder for Megan to break through. So she just climbed over.
Good job. All right. Okay, guys. Okay, let's give everybody a hand. You guys are trapped up here. I'm sorry. All right. Let's see. I don't know if you can get out from under this. Thank you for that demonstration, guys. So, what was the point of all that? It was fun. Because what happens is we've tried to look and see is what happens to these nets, because we know they're important for memory. So we said, well, let's just give cocaine to these rats, and let's see what happens to the nets. So here's a net that's shown here, and this is pretty open net. You can see there's not a lot of green on top of this. And what we think happens is that net, now it kind of opens up, okay? So there's not much of a net there. Usually there's a little bit of a net, but when we give cocaine, it kind of dissolves a little bit, and you don't have as much. So we think that that allows more of those connections to come in, and that might help form that new cocaine memories. They form very easily, okay? And then what we find, though, is when I wrap that around and around and around, we see that's what happens after repeated cocaine injections. If we give repeated cocaine, we've got all of these are already formed back from here, right? So we've got all these formed, but you can see the net is a lot thicker now, or it's a lot more intense. And so we think what happens is that increase in the net may kind of lock in the cocaine memories and not allow new memories to form, which is one of the problems in addiction, is that new memories, trying to give new rewarding experiences to people is very difficult. It's very difficult for them to feel rewarded from that. And it may be because these memories are so strong and they're kind of locked in. Part of that might be because of these perineuronal nets. So one other thing that I wanted to show you that we did was, what if we remove the nets? What if we just take them away, we dissolve them? It turns out there is a way to dissolve that. You can just buy this little chemical compound and we can dissolve them. And then we find out what happens. Well, to figure out what happens, we have to have some sort of models of addiction in animals, right? So we have a couple of different models, and one is this conditioned place preference model here, and the other one is the self-administration. And I'll just show you briefly a little bit of this, but I want to start with the conditioned place preference model, and first find out how many people have been here before. Okay, and then how many of you will go upstairs and get a beer or wine? So some of you. So let's say that they don't have the beer or the wine one day. Hopefully that'll never happen, right, Amanda? Okay. What would you do? Well, I mean, let's just say you walk in. What do? You come in, you think you're coming to this. What do you do then? What's the next thing you do? Go upstairs. Okay, you go upstairs. Let's say there's nothing there. I hate to tell you, you've been conditioned place preferenced, and that's this procedure right here. So what we're going to do is try to train the animal, and humans, believe me, can be trained to do this, right? We've trained the animal to like one side of the box compared to the other side of the box. In our case, we train them to pair one side of the box with cocaine, and the other with just nothing. Basically, it's saline. It doesn't do anything. So the way we do this is we say, okay, here's that same box. It's got 3 compartments. We take a rat, we put it in there, and we say, well, where do you want to spend your time? The rat explores all over, right? It goes back and forth, back and forth. And then at some point, we say, okay, we're going to give you cocaine on this side. We're going to close the door. Close the door. Oh, not yet. We're going to close the door. Okay. And so here's the cocaine side. We give the animal the cocaine. And it just sits there for about a half an hour just experiencing cocaine. Then we say, well, the next day, we're going to put you on the other side. We're going to give you a boring saline injection. It does nothing. It's just saline. And then we're going to close the door, and you're going to sit there for half an hour. The animal probably is bored. And we do this day after day, and the animal just alternates daily. And so pretty soon, it learns to condition to this side, and it will almost always go to this side of the box where they experience cocaine. So that's how you do that kind of model of addiction. I know it seems kind of funny, but this is how the rats tell us what they want or what they like. So we said, well, let's remove the nets in that prefrontal cortex. So here are the nets here that you saw earlier, all these green structures here. And we give these little Pac-Man. This is our, it's just an enzyme that we can buy. And what we found is that animals no longer prefer this side. So basically, they have no preference for the side where they experience cocaine, and they'll just kind of go back and forth and spend equal time. So they need to have their nets for that consolidation process. They're needed for that initial forming that memory that cocaine is giving them. Then we wanted to know, could we block relapse? And I won't go through all the details that we do to try to look at relapse model, but it's basically the same kind of idea to say, okay, well, what can we block this step right here? Because this would be really important. The animal is already addicted. What if they're already addicted? Could we now kind of diminish their memory for that cocaine? And so we did the same thing, only we already trained the animals, and then we got rid of their nets. And we found that they didn't have a preference. So this, again, is representing an animal that just doesn't care anymore. So we could block this reconsolidation process, this process right here. And we think that's really important because unless you can get an addict who's kind of in midstream and still learning about that drug, that's very difficult to do. So you really want to look toward treatments that you could give afterwards. So self-administration. So this is the gold, kind of the gold standard for addiction scientists. And this is because the animal has a choice. The animal will learn to press a lever and give itself a drug. So this can be used for lots of different drugs. So what we did was we tried to create the drug environment, basically this box that the animal goes in. And then we tried to create the feeling of the drug, and this is because the animal will be getting a little bit of drug every time it presses the lever. It gets just a little smidge of drug that gets to its brain very rapidly. Just to tell you, this whole business right here, this is just basically a harness to kind of hold all this in place so the animal doesn't to get rid of it's a small tube that has to go into one of their veins. And then we also create the drug cues. This is a little light, and later on, after they learn that this light is associated with cocaine, they will just sit there and press just for that light, not even getting any drug. So that's kind of like the cocaine cues. So we try to do our best to recreate this situation. And I'll just show you a video of what this would look like. So this animal you can see that he's exploring and everything here, but there's a lever here and a lever here. This one gives it cocaine. So he's kind of coming over, he's sniffing, then he pushes it, and you can see when the light is on, he's actually getting a little infusion of cocaine, which gets immediately to his brain. And this light comes on and it tells him, as long as that's on, even if you press that lever, you're not getting any more cocaine. And we have to do that because they'll overdose. So we have to kind of give them, they call it a timeout light. So that light's gone off, and they kind of learn this after a while, what that interval of time is. This is 20 seconds for this rat. And he'll kind of work his way over, he's sniffing a lot, that's what they do when they're on cocaine. Kind of sniff the lever, interact with the lever a little bit, and then push it again. You can see, so this is a much better model for people to use. And we use this one quite a bit in our lab. So we removed nets in the prefrontal cortex. We did the same thing just to see if they would acquire the drug habit. And the question is, do they? And I'm happy to say I will not show you any graphs of this, but I'll put a big X over that. They don't. They will press a little bit, but not very much. So they'll have low levels of pressing that lever. So they're not really all that interested in it. So we think that these nets that are in the prefrontal cortex are really important for somehow capturing that memory of addiction. And so overall, we think that we can disrupt these drug memories. And that's something that we continue to work on, is this disrupting this reconsolidation process, which I think is really important as a kind of a new approach to addiction. So just to reiterate what I was saying earlier, that we seek novelty and new sensations, and just by virtue of the fact that we have to do this for our survival, probably gets us in trouble, okay? There's too much of a good thing when it turns out, when it's drugs of abuse. Addiction is a chronic disease, and I think one of the things I hope you come away with is realizing that this has to be treated in a chronic way. It has to be treated in a very long-term way for certain people. And that memories trigger relapse. And our ideal situation would be that we could somehow diminish those memories so they don't have the control over people's behavior, over the drug-seeking and drug-taking behavior. And with that, I'd like to thank this great crew, all the individuals. Here's a number of individuals that did all the work. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for listening. If you have a minute, I'd like to ask you for a bit of help. We're still trying to build an audience for the podcast because we want more people to have a chance to learn about science, and we need your help in getting the word out. We're on Facebook and Twitter at SciBar Podcast, which is SCIBAR Podcast, and we'd really appreciate it if you could post or tweet about us. You could also help us by reviewing us on iTunes. If you're in the Pacific Northwest and would like to come to an event, our list of upcoming topics is at our website at scienceontaporwa.org, and that last part stands for Oregon and Washington. You can also find out more about the events on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at scienceontaporwa. As always, I'd like to say a big thank you to some of the volunteers who help run the show. They are Scott Fry, Chris Gowan, Sam Lauk, Rita Nygren, and Steve Peri. Some of those lovely people have been helping me run events for nearly 10 years, and this would not happen without them. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Amber Peoples for doing all the heavy lifting for the past few months. Finally, thank you to Jonathan Colton for letting us use his song Mandelbrot Set as our intro and outro music.